You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Kim Brown, broadcasting live from Tampa, Florida for the Republican National Convention. I'm joined here with the former ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Mr. Bolton, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Well, very glad to be with you.
Ambassador, you are serving as an advisory role on foreign policy to the Romney campaign. When it comes to issues of Russia, it seems as if the former governor had an early misstep in categorizing the current relations between the U.S. and the Russian Federation, where he was quoted as saying that Russia was America's number one geopolitical ally. He was actually not reprimanded, but chastised by then-President Dmitry Medvedev. How would you categorize the current state of relations between our two nations?
Well, I don't think they're very good myself, and that's despite the Obama administration's pressing the famous reset button, even after making what I consider to be unjustifiable concessions, giving up missile defense bases in Poland and the Czech Republic, signing the ill-advised New START arms control treaty. The Russian response, I think, has been inadequate, to say the least. And, the most recent example in dealing with the problem of the Assad regime in Syria is that Russia, along with China, has vetoed 3 separate UN Security Council sanctions resolutions and made it very plain that despite the Obama administration's hopes, Russia has no intention of working a way to get the Assad regime to step aside from power. So I think that the question of how to deal with Russia is going to be very much on President Romney's agenda if he's elected this November.
Do you feel as if that the tone of relations between both Russia and the United States have a tendency to change depending on which political party is in the White House at the time? At the moment, as you mentioned, the relations do seem slightly tense, but there's seeming to be a decent rapport, at least then, between President Obama and then President Medvedev, though Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin have not formally met. Does the tone change depending on which party is in the White House?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances of the relations between the two governments. And, in fact, the conversation that President Obama had with then-President Medvedev, the famous hot microphone conversation where Obama said, just give me some space until after the election and then I can be more flexible toward Russia, is actually something I think we'll see played over and over again in our campaign, because it was a very ill-advised comment by President Obama to be, in effect, negotiating on his own behalf instead of on behalf of the United States. I think tone depends a lot on personalities, but I think you read the tone into the circumstances that the two countries have. There was a time in the relationship between President George W. Bush and President Putin in his earlier term that seemed to be very good personally. But that's when relations between the two countries were better. When they took a turn for the worse, people could say that's tone. But in my view, it's not really tone. It's the substance of the circumstances the two countries find themselves in.
Russia has recently ascended into the World Trade Organization after, I believe it's been 18 years they've been trying to get into this organization. America was essential in making sure, or at least making sure that path was able to happen more recently. How will that affect at least trade relations between our two nations?
Well, I think a lot depends on whether Russia adheres to the commitments that it makes in terms of protection of intellectual property, non-discrimination against investment and trade by foreigners. There was a lot of optimism when China was brought into the World Trade Organization about 12 years ago. Unfortunately, foreign investors, not just the United States, but Europeans as well, often feel discriminated against in favor of domestic Chinese businesses, and that remains a great source of concern and tension. So given this long history of the negotiation between Russia and her bilateral trading partners and the whole admission process, people are very much hoping that we're not going to see the same thing in the case of Russia, and that'll just have to develop as time goes by.
Getting back to Syria, Mr. Ambassador, as you mentioned, that Russia and China have used their veto powers on the UN Security Council to veto resolutions on more aggressive tactics on Syria and the Assad regime. Do you think that it would be possible for the U.S. and Russia and the other powers that are on the Security Council to come to some sort of consensus in what to do about Syria? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I think the real question is what Russia wants to see, and the Obama administration, I think most people in the United States agree that the Assad regime has to go. Obviously, there's an important question, what replaces it? But every indication we've had is that Russia, China, Iran are prepared to fight it out, to support Assad in his efforts to fight it out, to stay in power. And I think the Obama administration misread the Kremlin in a very substantial way by thinking for the last 18 months that Russia indeed had the same objective, that is to say, peacefully easing Assad out of power. I think that's clearly not the case. So if Russia's determined to provide assistance, material assistance, weapons, advice, political cover to help Assad stay in power, then I think our interests are very divergent, and I don't see what the common ground would be.
Should Mitt Romney become elected president, and you obviously being one of his foreign policy advisors, how would you advise him on how to deal with Mr. Putin and Russia going forward?
Well, I think, in America, plain speaking is a virtue. And I think it's a virtue in diplomacy as well. I think you state unambiguously what your interests are. The party across the table states what its interests are, and then you see if there's common ground. It's a lot better to do that than to operate in the dark or under a misperception. And I've met President Putin. I've seen him in action. He strikes me as a very direct person and would respond to somebody who talks back to him in the same terms. So that's the place I would start to see whether indeed, when we actually lay out where we are on some of these issues. Syria is a good example. Iran's nuclear weapons program is another example. North Korea's nuclear weapons program is another. Whether we see these things the same way, whether we share common objectives, and whether there's some prospect for moving forward.
When the Republican presidential field was still not yet decided and there were many candidates in the field, there were many calls for you even to jump into the race and run for president. There seems to be a somewhat of an undercurrent of Americans' desires to see a non-elected official run for president. Your name was tossed out there along with Condoleezza Rice, along with Colin Powell. What factored into your decision not to run, and would you consider a run in the future?
Well, I actually took a pretty serious look at it, but it's very hard in the American political system to run for the top job when you haven't run for lower jobs. And I wish that weren't the case, but reality is what it is, and that's ultimately why I decided not to run. But I think there is, as you say, there's a feeling that the professional political class of both parties has gotten itself very distant from where the people are. And so I think it's important, in our case for Governor Romney, to make the point, which is very important. He's only been governor of Massachusetts for 4 years. The rest of his life was in the private sector. He was not a political figure. He was a businessman. And I think that's something that people appreciate because they know people in business who are successful solve problems. They don't talk about it, they do things. And if Governor Romney can make that case, I think he'll be successful himself in November.
If you could rate the Obama administration's foreign policy handling over this initial term, how would you grade them?
Well, not very high, because I think we've seen a decline in America's geostrategic position around the world. I think we're in a lot worse shape in a variety of important areas: the Middle East, the struggle against international terrorism, trying to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and a pretty long list. And I think that's because really President Obama is different from other American presidents since Franklin Roosevelt. He's far more concerned with his domestic priorities than he is with threats to the United States internationally. And I think that makes him different from Democratic and Republican presidents in the past. I think Governor Romney understands that there's a relationship between America's presence in the world and sustained economic prosperity at home in a way that Obama has not. And I think that'll be an issue for the voters in November.
Obviously, a lot of large looming geopolitical issues for the United States foreign policy to have to tackle, even for the current president and possibly future president in November. But which do you think has the highest priority? Would it be Afghanistan? Would it be Iran? Would it be our trade dealings with China? What do you think is the issue abroad that the next president or the current president needs to focus on the most?
Well, I think the most urgent problem is Iran's proximity to getting deliverable nuclear weapons. We don't know exactly when that will be, but we will have an International Atomic Energy Agency report coming out very shortly that shows that Iran is making steady progress toward that objective. And an Iran with nuclear weapons would change the balance of power in the Middle East forever. It would have really global effects. So there's real urgency in trying to find a way to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and I think that's top of the list for the next president, whether it's Obama staying in office or Mitt Romney on January 20th of next year.
Would a Romney administration support Israel if they were to go ahead with a preemptive strike on Iran?
Well, I think it's very clear that Governor Romney's been unambiguous that he's not going to permit Iran to have nuclear weapons. I think he's got credibility on that point. Nobody thinks the military option is an attractive option, but an Iran with nuclear weapons is a lot less attractive.
And lastly, Ambassador, what suggestions would you have for either Governor Romney or for President Obama in terms of the priorities of how we need to continue to ameliorate relations between the Russian Federation and the U.S.?
Well, I think it really requires on President Obama's part or Governor Romney more attention to international affairs than the Obama administration has showed. And I think on Russia's part, really, the onus of how the relationship is going to go lies in Moscow. If Russia continues to protest against American efforts at national missile defense, for example, I think that's going to be a problem. I thought we had resolved this issue back in 2001 when we negotiated the American exit from the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty. So I've been surprised to see the issue come back up again, but we were able to reconcile President Putin to it then. I'd like to think we could do so again.
All right, we've been speaking with the former ambassador to the United Nations under the administration of George W. Bush, Mr. John Bolton. Mr. Bolton, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me.